The paper was related to Carl Jung and his paper, which was called The Psychology of the Unconscious. And it was published in 1912. And if he was publishing it now, that moment before you submit a paper, it's all digital now, you hesitate to press the button to submit it because life is never the same again after that, or sometimes, very often actually. And life was never the same for Carl Jung because he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that his great friend and father figure, really, Sigmund Freud, would strongly disapprove, and it would probably end their relationship, personal and professional. And indeed it did. And I think that says more about Freud than Jung, quite frankly. And I don't think it reflects him in a good light, because we all know that the young generation study under us, and there comes a point when they wish to go their own way and develop their own ideas. This is the way of life. And I think Freud should have celebrated and embraced that rather than being extremely difficult. Certainly for sure, we know that Jung was extremely disappointed, and in fact was unsettled for several years after that. So what was it in his paper that so annoyed his colleague? Well, the split was really about something that sounds quite trivial. Freud's view on their views of the unconscious mind, and I don't think anybody has come up with anything better than that since. But Freud's view was that mental illness, mental health issues are, particularly the neurotic ones, because everybody recognized there was nothing they could do for the psychotic, serious mental disorders. And frankly, there's not too much that can be done these days. But their field was the field of treating patients with neurotic disease. And Freud's view was that these all related to incidents in history, probably even in early childhood. And there was always, or very often, an overlay of sexuality here, sexual misidentification or whatever, and including the Oedipus complex, which is really rather difficult for many of us to understand now. But there is no question about it that of the primeval drives and emotions, then that related to sexuality, they're certainly well up on the list. Whereas from Jung came, he was starting to develop his views on the collective unconscious. And he didn't rush into things, because I think it was 1952 before he actually published his paper on the collective unconscious. And his view was that there is no point reliving past trauma. And because the danger of that is that all too easily, it can be a concession to the ego of the patient. It can be an abrogation of responsibility, like, this happened to me. It wasn't my fault, I didn't deserve this, and now it's blighted my life. And the past avoids the responsibility that all of us have for the present moment. That is really, frankly, the only responsibility we have, because it's the only moment of time that we can work in. And certainly, Jung, certainly he felt that his therapy was done and could only be done in the moment. And those of us who are therapists, we know, particularly in the talking therapies and the hypnotherapy and things like that, and psychotherapy, we know during a consultation that if we're lucky, there is this moment where we just know progress has been made. So it's almost like a little ping. But the frustrating thing is you don't know how that happened, why it happened, and how you can make it again. These are questions that the ego likes to ask, and they don't help. As we talked about last week, I think it's about the law of surrender. There are things we just have to let go of stuff and trust the moment to protect us, because it's in the moment that the collective unconscious works, or the concept of higher intelligence or infinite intelligence, or the space that God occupies. people have so many different ways of describing that, but anybody who's felt this, they know what it is, even if they can't put words to it. And the thing that I really enjoyed about reading this paper was something I hadn't known before, and was that Jung considered anxiety to be a friend. He didn't use that word. When I put a Facebook announcement on earlier today about tonight's webinar, I said, we're going to kick off with how anxiety is your friend. And what Jung said is that anxiety is the unconscious mind speaking. And before I'd read that, I would have always thought, well, anxiety comes from the ego. Anxiety is trying to protect the status quo, to keep you in your comfort blanket. Well, and Jung's view, which really blew me away, is that it's not that at all, that it is the unconscious mind crying for attention, quite frankly. And we've talked about this in relation to physical illness, and we've talked about the default state of the human being is to heal itself, as Hippocrates said. And we have many other default states. Our default is to be confident. All of these problems that we see in our lives are not the way we were designed and evolved to live as functioning human beings. So on firmer ground now, I mean, in the medical world, which I don't practice in that anymore. I'm licensed, I'm registered, but this is my chosen career now. But I know that very often people will come into your surgery and, or you'll see them in hospital and they've had a heart attack. And they said, this all started about 6 months ago. I started to feel like I wasn't well, started to get little twinges in my chest or down my arm or something. And I didn't do anything about it. Well, this, in a way, could be the inner healing taking place. This could be the intuition. This could be the kick. Do something. In the analogy that I used, if you start to get symptoms like that, you see your doctor, you have angiograms, now they can do wonderful microsurgery, removing blood clots and things in your coronary arteries. Don't wait for a heart attack. And I've seen this with athletes who are overtraining. They train and train and train, and they ignore all the warning signs, and then something knocks them completely flat. Often it's a virus they pick up. So this does seem to be a system that certainly applies in some parts of the body, but I've never thought it applied to the mind before. So an anxiety, Jung considered that we're all on a journey, and this journey does not involve us staying in the comfort blanket, because we're not going to learn anything new there. Yes, it's going to be comfortable, but it won't help us on what he would call the journey of individuation. And the goal of that journey is to meet divine wisdom, or I think he used some words like that. And if you respond to this anxiety and think about it and try and identify what this anxiety is about, rather than trying to soothe the anxiety, try and find a course of action or a strategy that will then allow the anxiety to dissolve. And Jung gave an example of many of his patients who came to see him were looking to establish a long-term relationship, but hadn't met anybody suitable. And the reason one of the main reasons they hadn't met anybody suitable was that they didn't have the courage to walk across the floor at a social meeting and chat to a member of the opposite sex. And this is still very common in these days as well. Now, when we're talking about a neurosis, there's generally not any blood on the floor. And it's very strange that brave people in other ways can show their courage in many different other ways, and that there are supposedly simple things that they can't do. And the list goes on and on. There are people who can't step foot on a plane. And so they deprive themselves, their partners and their children of the opportunity of traveling to and having wonderful holidays and things like that, all because of an illogical fear. We have people who are frightened of standing up and speaking in public, and they can't make the speech at the daughter's wedding. They have to get somebody else to do it for them. Well, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it's a great shame. And these phobias and fears go on and on. So Jung would definitely say, confront your anxiety bit by bit if necessary. That's a concession. We've talked about concessions before. And it will be painful. And it was for him. It would be painful for him to press that button, submitting his paper, knowing what it was going to do. But it definitely, he went through a dark period, but he developed his own voice. And his other contributions to psychology are as valued, at least as much now as they ever were then. And if he'd stayed under the shadow of Freud, he would have been under the shadow, and these papers wouldn't have happened. So there's a little introductory thing to get you thinking about, possibly to stimulate some comment and questions. And I had another question as well from a gentleman called Tommy. I met Tommy about 4 or 5 years ago. He was actually making a TV documentary, and he and the crew came to visit me, and we spent a nice morning together, and we managed to get the footage we needed. And they were interviewing me about luck, because it was just after I published my book, Get Lucky Now. Anyway, so he got in touch with me on LinkedIn a couple of days ago and said, I've got a question for you. He said, what about this luck thing? What can we do to get lucky? And I thought, well, I haven't got time for 2 big questions like that, just as an introduction. But fortunately, I've already asked Tommy's question, because we call it luck. We could call it anything else, but we're supposed to be lucky. So you just have to be a little bit brave and let go of stuff and put yourself in situations that you wouldn't ordinarily choose to, and allow the luck to do the heavy lifting on your behalf. You're certainly not going to have very much luck at finding a future partner if you can't go and talk to them, at least to get to know what their name is. So, Tommy, I don't know whether you're watching. If not, I'm sure you'll be catching this on YouTube. But there you are. That's luck. So, I wonder what questions or comments you might have brought, because, as you know, I much prefer thinking about questions and admiring other people's comments than I do about making speeches. I think I must have a fear of making speeches that go on for more than 5 minutes. So if anybody who wants to speak, put your hand up and Ludwig will call you in, or if you can send your question to him if you wish, and he will read it to me if you don't want to be on camera.
If not, I'm gonna ask the question. So, guys. No? Okay. Stephen, you just said about anxiety. This is what is my main problem in my life, the anxiety and the low self-confident. And do you think a first step to force the anxiety is acceptation?
Is, what did you say? Sorry?
To force the anxiety is the acceptation of the anxiety of this feeling in me. Is it a first step, good step to force the anxiety?
I think it's good to accept the anxiety, because everybody in the world has anxieties. They sometimes don't talk about them, but everybody has periods of their life when they go through situations that make them anxious. And this, I'm not sure that Carl Jung said any of this bit that I'm going to say, but anxiety is a thought. And we know that thoughts are transient. I mean, you can't point at something and say, you see that thing over there, that's anxiety. No, it's not. Anxiety is something that's in your head. And we all know that we can think about one thing, well, 7 things at any one time, and every second we start introducing new thoughts. I mean, people are never in the same state of anxiety for every second of the rest of their life. They can certainly spend a lot of the rest of their life in anxiety. And, and Carl Jung, he described that. He said, when you confront anxiety, you've got two choices. There are only two choices. You can decide you're going to deal with it, deal with the source of anxiety, or you can ignore it. And if you ignore it, he said, these are the people that we sometimes called, he used a Latin name, but a better name that we would know, it would be Peter Pan syndrome. We all know some people who are very good at what they do, but they never move any further on. They don't move on in their thinking, in their achievements, in their happiness. Their life stays pretty much the same because they are ignoring the promptings that the unconscious mind is giving them. Now, I mean, it's curious to me, Ludwig, because you certainly don't come across as a person of low confidence or of anxiety. And as we were discussing earlier, you have chosen a career that is going to test those qualities in anybody. So I'm curious as to what attracted you to the career of being an actor, which I know from personal experience is a demanding one.
That's a good question, Stephen. Thank you. I always dreamt about it, to be an actor, to direct movies, to write screenplays, etc., etc., etc. This was always in me from since I remember, we can say, and that was what I was most afraid of, this career. So during my whole life, I tried many different works, paths or careers, we can say. But when I started to be sober and I changed my life, I asked myself what I'm most afraid of, and the answer was acting. I need to check if it's my career or not, and I started to do everything in that direction. I left my job, my old job, and I started to face the fears. And I told myself, if it's not my career, okay, I'm gonna accept that, but I need to try. But later, the best comes, you know. The director, the right school, people on my way who says, you know, I know the guy, call him, you know, etc., etc. So the universe, the God, as I believe, just because of this, maybe it's a good connection to the Tommy question, the luck came to me because I was ready for it, we can say.
Yeah. Well, I think you've probably largely, if not completely, answered your own question. And there are a lot of very strong statements in what you've just said that I totally agree with. Once you, the difficulty, well, it's not actually that difficult, but sometimes we make it difficult. The difficulty is knowing what we want from life. Now, our unconscious, call it what you will give nudges. Because when you ask somebody what they really enjoy doing, they'll tell you straight away. Usually they don't have to think about it too much. Or sometimes they might answer it slightly different way. Well, I know what I'd like to do. I'd like to be an actor, but I'm just not confident. I can't imagine being on a set with cameras and people looking at me. Well, there's lots of people like that. Lots of people who say, I'd really like to write a book, but I can't bear to think of other people reading it and not liking it. So, you know, that's definitely ego talk. So you see, you recognized a couple of issues there that were possibly barriers. it seems like they weren't, and you confronted them. You decided that the instinct that you had, the intuition you had, was so strong that this is what you wanted to do. You said, at least I'm going to give it a try. And you have done. And I think that the confidence that you talk about, I think that it's already diminishing, because you are putting yourself into that situation. And the more you put yourself into a situation that causes you anxiety, it just works like that, because the brain becomes settled. The reptile brain, or whatever we're going to call it, is beginning to realize, oh gosh, this isn't so bad after all. I can see that I'm maybe got progress to make, but I'm doing well so far. And you will know, as I do, there are many, many, many actors who've struggled with confidence issues, and it hasn't stopped them. In fact, generally speaking, sooner or later, it makes them a better actor. Because, as Jung would say, you have to go through this dark period, this period of pain, to come out the other side. Because when you come out that other side, you will have learnt stuff that is priceless. Because, as you say, once you commit to something, you start to get lucky, because it's as if you're calling on the invisible giants or God, higher intelligence. Things seem to go your way. You get nudges along the path. And it's a great feeling. And that's like a reward. That makes it worth the pain. Because as you know the expression, don't know whether you have this in Polish, but we say, no pain, no gain. And that's true. It's one of these cliches that just happens to be true. Nothing good was ever done, nothing good was ever achieved because it was easy. The difference between successful people, I'm making massive generalizations here, successful people and people who don't achieve what they want to do, is because success people just get on with it. Now, I'm not talking about physical situations that will put you in real danger, physical danger. Nobody's ever died on a film set because of lack of confidence, as far as I'm aware. I mean, ask yourself the question, what's the worst that can happen? If you're frightened of public speaking, you ask yourself the question, what is the worst that can happen? And do you think people are going to remember this the next day? You'll be lucky if they remember anything you say for 5 minutes. Same with a book you've read. What was the last book I read? I can't even remember the title. Certainly can't remember whether, I thought it was good. That's about as far as I can go. So people take themselves a bit too seriously, or rather ego makes us take ourselves a bit too seriously. There's I see Caroline's got her hand up. Yeah, please come in. Can you unmute yourself, or Ludwig can do it for you maybe?
I didn't want to interrupt because I did get that argument. And I thought that was quite clear. But my question was, sometimes I don't get anxiety, but what about, how do you differentiate? Sometimes maybe anxiety is there. Is that anxiety, or is it your gut instinct saying, actually, this is a wrong thing for you? And I need to differentiate.
Yeah, I was wondering about that as well. And they are two different things. And I think intuition rather than, or gut instinct, say, rather than the message from the unconscious that this is an anxiety, it's a cry for help. You're feeling bad at the moment, but this is your opportunity to confront this. Believe me, if you don't confront this, your life is going to be poorer for it. And then I think, Caroline, you were saying, well, what if this is a gut instinct, and it's true that if I decide I'm, even though I've got major reservations about becoming an actor, what if I really push myself? Is there a real downside to that? I mean, that's a good question. Now, physically, it's unlikely to be a downside to it. But mentally, I guess you could put yourself under such extreme pressure that you become, more ill with it. The stress could make you physically ill. But I think that would be rare, because when people know in their heart what they want to do, they find the opposite. Once they start, we're evolved to be, we are things of action. We're designed to do stuff, not really to think about stuff. So once we take that first step and go to that audition, it's almost like, we're committed, we're in the game. And the anxiety normally starts to lift a bit then. And the reason why it lifts is because the anxiety, wherever that's coming from, is saying, oh, that's great. I'm glad you're listening. Trust me, go with me. This will get better. Even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it. So that is a tricky question to answer, but that's my take on it. Johnny's got his hand up.
Hi, Steve. Slightly at a tangent. Do you think people that have, say, life experiences that are traumatic, be it whether it's in relationships or home life, can that have a long-term change of someone's biochemistry in the brain that might lead them to forms or lose, say, a certain amount of, say, discipline to do the things they like, and that within itself is a guide? Or do you think that we can use our intuition, but will that overcome people that are, say, struggling with, say, addictions and have had, say, some traumatic times, stopping them from doing what they might want to do because it involves something that could be addictive?
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that one, Johnny. I think most people, at some point in their lives, they have bad past experiences that haunt them to a greater or to a lesser extent. And just as I was saying earlier about the difference between Jung and Freud, the way they would approach this, there's plenty of schools of thought, even now, that you should lead your client into the past, and you should fully discover the enormity of the situation there. And I fully identify all the colors and flavors of this particular situation. And it's only by that self-knowledge that healing can take place. My opinion, and it's only my opinion, is that I just don't agree with that. Perhaps the nearest personal experience I've had of it is that in my former job, I was working in Africa, and one of the jobs that I had to do was to debrief or people who had been kidnapped, captured for ransom. These would be expatriates working in the oil field typically, but they could be from other walks of life. And some of them had been seriously mentally traumatized. Fortunately, very few of them were physically traumatized, but mentally, I'd say all of them had been to some extent, some very seriously. And I had major fallouts with the security forces because they wanted to go in, as you can imagine, where they're coming from. They wanted to extract all the information about this incident so they could track down the gang and shut them down and all those kinds of things. And I fully understood that. But they weren't trained in the kind of questioning that will allow a client to go there with a therapist. It's highly skilled stuff. And they were going in with big feet. And I really think that they were doing more harm than good, even though that's not what they were trying to do. And I didn't get very far in trying to convince them there would be a kinder, gentler, and actually more productive way to go about it. So anyway, that's my personal experience. But to generalize it more, I don't find too many answers in going into the past. I'm with Jung on this one. The moment is the one where the miracles happen, when we get lucky, and when we get healing, and when we get resolution, and stuff like that. I mean,
sorry, Steve. Even if you let go of the past of what's happened, and that's not a problem, but do you think some of those effects can have certain changes neurologically in your brain, that you might not be able to do things that you could have done before, even though you've let go of the past. But it just, is that possible?
Well, I know what you mean, and it's a good thing to ask. But I don't believe that these things are permanent. I think they can be. I mean, I think we've talked on one show about chronic depression, and when somebody's depressed for long enough, I mean, it becomes a habit, and it is neurochemical. There is if you like, a physical basis for it, that we make in our brain too much of the negative hormones, neurotransmitters, and not enough of the good ones. So it takes something to break that cycle, because the longer people leave it, the more resistant, more hard it can be to break into that cycle. But as you know, it's all done one brick at a time. You know, if somebody's been chronically depressed for 6 years, you're unlikely to immediately get rid of that. But you can certainly, I think you can always find a way to make a person feel better and have their head in at least a slightly better place. And that's where you start. Because frankly, a person who's in a situation as you described, Johnny, they don't want to be like that for sure. And I think if you look for like reasons, like I'm feeling bad because this thing happened, that may well be true, but I don't think it takes you anywhere. I mean, everybody will have their own words and their own emotions that they'll attach to this. Like, yes, this thing happened to me then, and I wish it hadn't done. And maybe there were things that I could have done then that would have had a better outcome, and I wouldn't have got into this state. But you see, the truth is, we can't change the past, but we can change the way we think about the past. And that's the direction I'd be coming from, Johnny. And in your case, I mean, I know that you've got things you want to achieve in life. You've got very big dreams. Well, that tells me, I mean, I know that you're not chronically depressed anyway, but people who can see hope out there, people who've got a big dream, that they're on that journey. They're already started. They're already well started. And sooner or later, they'll get that help from some probably totally unexpected source that will clear the next barrier for them. And I mean, we've talked about Viktor Frankl, you know, the concentration camp survivor, and he says as long as there's something in the future to hope for, the resilience of the body kicks in. But it's got to be a big thing. Can't be a little thing. It's got to be big, a big dream. The bigger the better. And if the dream you've got at the moment doesn't feel real enough, the way to make a dream feel more real is to add more modalities to it. We only have 5 senses. That's all we have. We probably have a lot more than that. But those are the only ones that we can really be sure about. What we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we think, what we taste and what we smell. And the most important by far of that, because it recruits so many nerve cells, is what we see. And that's why the psychologists and sports psychologists, they say visualization. You got to do visualization exercises. And if you don't see it, it ain't going to happen. And when you can see it, make sure you're in the picture, right in the middle. And you can big up that movie, back on new movies now, because that's what a movie director will do. They will big up all of these 5 senses to make it a compelling message to the audience. And we are the audience of our own lives. How was that, Johnny?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Brilliant answer.
I hope so.
Always, yeah, it's always helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any question, guys? You're more than welcome. Oh yes, we have a question from Ray and from Ray first.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I was been listening to John here, and he triggered a memory for himself of long ago, of a fairly severe physical trauma. I was caught up in a bomb attack in London in the 70s, which was fairly seriously physically suffered, and it sort of escalated from there. The injury was such that where I was working, work was a bit sensitive, so I was shifted to a different job and things like that. It sort of escalated because of the event rather than because of me. And I found, looking back at it, I wasn't in control of what was going on. And what was being said, you were unlucky, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Looking back on it from now, I felt I was in the right place at the right time. It changed things. It pushed me along to start doing things again in a different way. I played as an amateur golfer, pretty good, left-handed as I've always been, and that went completely. I had to start all over again. Hard work from square one, and I developed it back to reasonably good right-handed. And I found the event made a big difference in the fact that it stimulated me, as I look on every moment now as important. So my approach to a lot of these traumas and things is, you should really perhaps be looking at it, you're in the right place at the right time. How do you see that one, Steve?
Well, first of all, Ray, thank you very much for sharing that. And, there's no question that, physical trauma is what can be harder to deal with than mental trauma. But often the two go together, and you'll be aware of this condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, where people, are always reliving this incident that happened to them. But more commonly, fortunately, are the people who say almost exactly what you said, that whilst it was painful at the time, and whilst it had massive effects on your life, you saw some good from it. And that's an incredibly courageous thing to say, but I hear that so many times from people. And sometimes I struggle to think, well, look, how can that be the best thing that happened at that time? But so many people say that. And that is something that I think defines whether somebody is going to be a survivor or a victim. And it seems to me, Ray, that you're very much a survivor. And I think that the people who watch this video or hear what you say, I think you're going to give them hope and inspiration. And I'm sure you haven't stopped there. I'm sure there are other things you want to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. But I found with a lot of these things, it's more people's reactions to you. You know, sort of within yourself, that you either can or can't deal with whatever it is that has happened. It's not very helpful. Other people sort of try to push you in a specific direction, and you feel within yourself you're capable of dealing with it, going a different way. So it tends to, I presume, trigger off some sort of positive reaction within yourself. I mean, I tend to treat every day as if it's my last one. And I pack as much into a day as I can. And that's worked fine for me. I deal now occasionally, I'm retired with them, with youngsters, some on the golf course where I play. I mean, I don't worry too much about it now. It doesn't mean a lot. It's not that important. It works fine. But I see them going from a practice ground, where some of them, I found it myself in days gone by, you work miracles. And then as you move to the first tee, or it like, it starts to drip away. And I see that these youngsters, and I've sort of decided there are a range of people within your own mind. And it's trying to get the right one out for the right occasion.
Yeah.
You know, think it depends how you talk to yourself. I've never been quite sure about how you talk or discuss with the subconscious, but I'm fully aware that if you talk to yourself in a sort of positive way, let the mind look at the nice weather and the warm breeze and the sun on your face as you move into a condition of potential stress, this can set you up to cope with what you've got to do. You've got to keep at it, because that pressure can always be there. So you just keep at it and gradually it becomes a sort of semi-natural process. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, because when I first started on this road, my first thoughts that I was going to use some of the skills that I'd learned to work with golfers, because golf is a crazy game played by crazy people, and I should know because I play golf as well. But there's nothing very logical. In fact, I wrote a book. My first book was called Play Magic Golf, and I had a hanging question that I kept putting in throughout the whole book. When I'd be giving examples, and I'd say, is golf a passion, an obsession, or an addiction? And I never answered the question, because I let other people decide. Because I've known golfers on the verge of suicide because they're not happy with their game. And as you say, it's a trivial pastime. It's there to be enjoyed, but there's an awful lot of mental stuff goes with it. So, maybe we can talk about that another time, or you might want to send me an email offline or something, and I'll share a few more thoughts with you. But yeah, there's an awful lot you can do, and it seems like you're coaching the youngsters. There's an awful lot you can do to clean up what we call the internal dialogue.
It's not really coaching, it's just that I've become aware they've moved from practice to the tee and they've become somebody else, and you try to bring them back to it all with the simplest thing. It's just a game. Enjoy.
Exactly. Well, thanks for Ray. Ludwig, I don't know, did we have another question? We just have time for one more, or maybe?
Yeah, it's not a question, but Angela is sharing with us a sentence. Hi, I work with the clients who often have a complex trauma history and have seen dramatic results, backed up by the clients about how their lives have changed.
Yes, well, I think that's what I said. I mean, there are many examples like this. And I mean, when somebody says, they say, this was the right thing that happened at the right time. Sometimes they'll go even further and they'll say, and they've had life-changing injuries, and they'll say, if I could change that now, I wouldn't. And that's a hard one for me to understand, but they say that with conviction. And I guess once again, they're demonstrating the courage of the survivor. And what Carl Jung would say, this is a person who's well on their journey of individuation. So I think that's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for being on the show. And I know we've had some new people as well this week, and we hope you come back. And this is your show as well. It's not just mine. We could have certainly gone a lot longer today, but I'm sure we've all had enough to think about for at least the next 10 years, perhaps. But I will be back same time next week, and I hope you will be. And I hope you'll have a wonderfully lucky week, and confront in a gentle way some of those anxieties, because it just doesn't have to be like that.